Okay, AP, this should be our last recording for Unit 1, and this should be much shorter. Hope to send you off to have you have more time to finish up your tests and your essays. So we are going to finish up Chapter 2 in particular, and if you remember yesterday, there's certainly more to these colonies than just one thing, but the main purpose from the perspective of the British, which we all were at that time, British colonies. Virginia is all about tobacco. That's the cash crop they've eked out that they've decided, oh, we can make money doing this as opposed to just funneling people in there to starve. Maryland becomes known for their harboring of Catholics, which at that particular moment in time, it was tough to be Catholic because the English government was very much Protestant. And now we're going to work into some of the other colonies at this time. And so this will be the final thing that will help you with the essays. If we go down here to the West Indies, the West Indies become known for their sugarcane production. So as a little bit of a reminder, tobacco, so common really throughout the whole region around Virginia, but in particular Virginia and Maryland, tobacco's a poor man's crop. You can plant it pretty simply, like very common to have a lot of children back then. So if you're a typical family and you have, your spouse, and then maybe 8, 9, 10 kids, they can all help you. And then well within a year, you can harvest them, lay them out to dry in your own home or in a barn. And then once they become dry and brittle, you can crumble them up, and there you go, you've got tobacco. Sugarcane, whole different ballgame. So sugarcane, to be profitable at scale, had to be processed in just massive numbers. So the average person couldn't even own enough land to even contemplate growing this. Then on top of that, it had this elaborate refinement process. You had to have a sugar mill. And so you had to have mass amounts of labor, which you're going to see largely became slave labor. And you're going to have massive amounts of land and refinement. Now, if you could get all of those things, it's kind of like starting a business. If you could just get that first million, maybe you could make the second million. Except in this particular case, unfortunately, the million, or today's dollars, the money they're using to get started is spent in many cases on slavery. Now, we are going to talk much, much more about slavery later on. I'm not trying to duck the topic at all. I'm keeping it in the perspective of how much of an influence was it on the colonies. The majority of the English colonies here in the mainland, New England, plantation and middle colonies, it wasn't yet. Now it's about to be. But at this moment in time, it's really only predominant in the West Indies. Because it's so predominant in the West Indies, because at certain points, slaves outnumber slave owners 4 and even 5 to 1, they realize they're in grave danger. The slave owners. Listen, let's just be logical about this. If purple people came and enslaved you, would you want to rise up and overthrow the purple people? Of course. This is human nature, and to think anything else is crazy. So the English who owned slaves in the West Indies knew this, so that's why they developed this incredibly barbaric, harsh set of rules called the Barbados Slave Code, right around 1661, I believe. And this slave code was put in place so that there was a set of rules that made it much, much more difficult for those enslaved to get information and or the freedom to even congregate enough to maybe even organize a rebellion. Now, this is important because eventually, and this is going to be later on in another chapter, this slavery is going to become much more common throughout the plantation colonies in particular. Now, you may have heard of the 1619 Project, and they named themselves over the idea that that's when slaves first come to Jamestown, and that is true. 42 years before the Barbados Slave Code. But I would still argue it's horrific no matter when it happens and to any scale. But at this moment in time, it is only to a large scale in the West Indies. It is not a large scale thing in the colonies, in the mainland colonies yet. Okay. That slave code, that barbaric slave code, is eventually when slaves become much more common in, say, the plantation colonies. That slave code follows them. And that's where you start to see the foundation of slavery, which is entirely different from what most of humanity had seen before that. One it's very much based on crazy racial ideas. Okay, so we'll set that aside. I promise that is not going to be avoided. But we're going to continue with the foundation of these colonies. Then we have the Carolinas. So this would have been the Carolinas at first, and obviously it's going to split up North Carolina, and this will eventually be basically South Carolina. The Carolinas are named after Charles II. This is a little side note back into world history again. England decided to go back and forth between being Catholic and being Protestant again. Through a series of civil wars, Charles I becomes king, and he's very Catholic. He is overthrown by a group of people called Puritans, who want to purify any semblance of Catholicism within the English government, and they behead Charles I. Oliver Cromwell, who was overthrown, and again, this is all world history. This is not going to be on the test, which you already know. It's a take-home test. But Charles II comes to the throne, and he restores sort of order. And he's not a Catholic king, but he's a king that's, let's say, patient, or that's not the right word either, tolerant of Catholics, much more so than other groups of people. So the Carolinas are named after this king, Charles II. And these would be generally people with a little bit more money. They're sort of favorites of the king's court. And after they do a lot of experimenting, what they decide is the crop that seems to fit best in the Carolinas is rice. And so that rice ends up becoming the foodstuff that is used to feed all of the slaves in the West Indies, because sugar is so valuable to the English economic system. It can make so much money for this fairly small percentage of rich landowners and the government, that they decide, we can't, quote unquote, waste any land growing food here. And so rice is grown here, among other foodstuffs, but that being the main one, and then sent to the West Indies to maximize the sugar. So there's this intricate economic system developing. But ironically, over time, the Carolinas develop a little bit differently. So again, we go to they're growing rice, but North Carolina just seemed to be a little bit different. The southern part of what was at first just the Carolinas, I think they split in 1712. This was where the rich people who were favorites of Charles II settled in. North Carolina tended to be where, yes, to some degree, some of the favorites of the king were there, but also a lot of people who used to be in Virginia, who maybe their land was cropped out and they just sort of filtered down through the north, the south to them and through North Carolina. And eventually you start to have a group of people who are, I think at the time would have been referred to as riffraff, people that were a little bit more boundless. And eventually what you see is the emergence of pirates, especially on the outer banks of North Carolina, and what we now think of as North Carolina. And man, did people in North Carolina not mind pirates? No, the aristocracy did, the rich people did, but the open acceptance among sort of the average person in North Carolina of pirates is absolutely insane. And some of the most famous pirates of the era, including, of course, Blackbeard, were very, very pronounced in this era. And this is an article about Blackbeard from Smithsonian Magazine in, February 2014. If you ever get a chance, and I know you're like, oh yeah, sure, in my free time, I'm going to read about Blackbeard. But it is absolutely a fascinating article about basically what we did and did not know about Blackbeard, how much he openly got away with stuff, how the government knew about him and decided it's not worth it to try to fight him, but also how he was not nearly as violent as you think he was. He showed a lot of violence in order to not be as violent as he needed to be, if that makes sense. His reputation made people sort of bow to submission, and so then he didn't have to fight nearly as many times to take over a ship. and that I believe, if I remember the article right, I haven't read it in over a year, I think his first confirmed murder was in the final battle that killed him. And so, just an interesting look, and it's all about things they had recently uncovered, documents that they hadn't found in certain libraries and records. And it just goes to show you that, somebody who existed in the early 1700s, his life is now being sort of fleshed out a little bit more as late as 2014. History, despite its reputation, is very much alive. But okay, that's my little rant. So, those are the Carolinas. That's only going to leave us with one more territory to cover today. And we'll get through a little bit more on New England a little bit later on in the Middle Colonies. These will be the next few units. We're going to, again, focus more on the foundation of these plantation colonies. And that is, we're going to get to Georgia, but to explain Georgia, we've got to explain what's going on with the Carolinas in one more respect. The Spanish are in Florida, and you can't quite see Florida here, but the Spanish are in Florida, and when they noticed the massive colonization of what we think of as the Carolinas, they really did not like what was going on. So they then started to pay Native Americans, who were still buffering between the English and the Spanish colonies, to attack and kill English settlers. Now, this is a very common theme of what will be the next 100 years. English colonists paying Native Americans to attack the French or the Spanish, and the Spanish or the French paying Native Americans to kill English. And really Native Americans trying to pit those superpowers against each other as well. Now, as an interesting side note, one of the things that our culture seems to hang on to very closely is that Native Americans scalped people. I think there's some really, really good evidence to suggest that they didn't dream this up, that this was not, in many of these tribes' cases, nations would be the proper term, something that was done before this era. It's that the Spanish were the ones who were saying, hey, we want you to essentially cut off the front of the head so that we can keep a tally of how much money we owe you, because we are going to pay you per person you kill, different rates for men and then women and children, repulsive, but we're going to pay you different rates for different age people and different genders, and we've got to have evidence. And Native Americans said, okay, and some tribes said, how about thumbs? And they said, oh, no, not thumbs. Now you can duplicate those. You got two thumbs. What we're going to do is the front of the head. And again, some native tribes may have been doing that, but the Spanish seem to introduce it at least to some of these tribes. So there were tremendous numbers of attacks along this frontier between Spanish-held territories and English-held territories, which is where Georgia comes in. Georgia becomes a buffer state. What an awful, awful job. It exists so that you have to go through some other people first before you get to the all-important rice-growing plantations. Because you can't lose the rice, because if you lose the rice, you lose the foodstuffs for the West Indies, and then therefore you lose the sugar. So you literally are going to create a human barrier, a buffer, like, oh, if Native Americans are going to kill people, let's make sure it's just these Georgia people, not the Carolinas, because we can't afford to lose them. Who in the world would volunteer to do that? Well, James Oglethorpe, the founder of Georgia, has just a certain group of people in mind. He has some personal experience with some friends that have had to go to debtor's prison. And in case you don't know what debtor's prison is, there was the English system at the time, and for a brief time, the American system was that if you owed money, you'd be sent to prison. And you could not get out until you paid off your debt, which basically means you had to have friends pay off your debt, or you sat in prison for the rest of your life. Wrap your head around that. If you didn't have anyone who could bail you out of your financial situation, you were doomed to stay in jail forever, because while in jail, it's really hard to turn around your financial situation. In addition, many of these debtors' prisons would charge you a daily rate for every day you were in jail. That was added to your debt. So Oglethorpe said, okay, instead of having these people just sort of, waste away in prison, why don't we use them as colonists as a buffer against the Carolinas? Now, I don't know, honestly, if they sold it a little bit differently to the people in debtor's prison. But if you're in prison, you didn't have much hope of getting out, I suppose it's better than nothing. So that winds up our early English colonies, these plantation colonies, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. We are going to, each unit is going to look at more of these colonies. And we're going to kind of bounce around in some of these years. But basically, they'll let you know that these become large plantations with these staple crops. And that, in and of themselves, is going to make it so cities are less likely to develop. And later on, that means sort of larger schools, larger learning institutions like colleges, just city government in general. It just doesn't really develop in the South like it does the North because there's smaller concentrations. It's very much more spread out over vast areas, which is why county government becomes much more prevalent in the South. And that's going to have an influence on how the United States government eventually develops. That is everything, ladies and gentlemen. Remember to make sure you get your essay turned in, submitted in under assignments before the due date or the due time tomorrow. And the same thing with your test. Make sure your test is complete and submitted before the due date, which is the start of class on Thursday. Okay? Take your time, get those done, and we will talk to you Thursday or Friday, whenever our live time is. All right, guys, have a good day.